Steven Spielberg, Guillermo del Toro and Ken Levine all hate them. Many critics consider them to be the last resort of video game storytelling. But like them or loathe them, cutscenes have been responsible for some of the most moving, impressive and controversial moments in gaming. And examining how they've developed is like shorthand for seeing how far the medium has come. Hankies at the ready, people, it's time for the complete history of cutscenes in games. Although the phrase itself wouldn't appear until 1987, there's an example of a simple cutscene as far back as 1980. The original Pac-Man had interludes between levels that told short stories, imparting a degree of narrative to a game about a yellow disc eating pills in a maze. Not especially impressive then, but a useful place to start. In fact, some early titles were more cutscene than game. Laserdisc releases such as Bega's Battle and Dragon's Lair, both from 1983, resembled one long cutscene with minimal interaction from the player. Each section usually required a single input at the correct time, meaning those games also provide us with our first example of a QTE or QuickTime event as well. After that, we get a few notable games which embrace the concept of short narrative introductions. Bugaboo the Flea from 1983 and Karateka from 1984 brought the cutscene to home computers. And the trend continued in 1987 with games such as the first Phantasy Star and La Abadía del Crimen, a murder mystery that was originally based on Umberto Eco's The Name of the Rose. And it's this year that we get our first example of the word cutscene being used to describe in-game cinematics in Ron Gilbert's Maniac Mansion. The game was a humorous send-up of horror and B-movies, and it popularised the point-and-click mechanics that would be synonymous with Gilbert's name throughout the 90s. It was seen as a significant step forward for video game storytelling, partly because of those story-rich cutscenes. Another narrative breakthrough came the following year with Hideo Kojima's Snatcher. This graphic adventure has many of the hallmarks of a classic COG title: drama, conspiracy, obvious cinematic influences, and lengthy exposition. And we got the original Ninja Gaiden in 1988 too, one of the most impressive and influential early cutscenes which contain more plot than the actual game itself. We've got two more important titles to discuss before we ease into the 90s, one good, one not so good. 1989's Prince of Persia began with some elegant scene setting that invested you in the fate of the imprisoned princess, and the same year we got this, the legendary opening movie from Zero Wing, complete with those fabulous mistranslations that are now embedded in the mind of every gamer. Everybody say it together now: all your base are belong to us. Now an established part of gaming, cutscenes became more prevalent in the 1990s, but another form of cinematic storytelling was on the horizon, bringing with it a fresh moral panic. Night Trap on the Sega CD, seen here as the remastered PC release, used full motion video in a game that saw you protecting teenage girls under siege by these terrifying vampiric monsters. And although we'd already seen FMV previously in arcades and on Laserdisc, Night Trap was memorable because of the media furore that came with it, suggesting completely erroneously that the object of the game was to cause harm rather than prevent it. Now that's not a defense of Night Trap, as you can probably tell, it's hardly a masterpiece, but it does give us an early example of media interest in violent video games. The industry was changing, games were becoming more realistic, and people were beginning to take note, even if it wasn't always for the correct reasons.
Don't make me use this, Tony.
Cutscenes became much more common as the rise of CD-ROM allowed for greater storage space and the wider use of FMV and high-quality voice tracks. 1995's Wing Commander 4: The Price of Freedom is an early example of developers using this tech to push cinematic boundaries. It features a host of proper actors, including Malcolm McDowell, Mark Hamill, and John Rhys Davies, and it makes you wonder why they even bothered to make the Hollywood film.
Let him go.
I don't see where this is your concern, mister.
I'm prepared to make it my concern.
And now we reach the true era of the cutscene, where every new game offered a chance to blow us away, or in some cases, suffocate us with cinematic cheese. 1996's Resident Evil is a great example of the B-movie aesthetic of the mid-90s, as is Command & Conquer Red Alert from the same year. And while mini-movies in games still felt like an event, it was the in-game and rendered cutscenes that really stood out as being impressive. A brilliant example is the opening of Final Fantasy VII, the sort of cutscene you'd visit a friend's house just to watch. This is why we remember this game looking so good, and it established a high watermark that the series would struggle to beat in the years that followed. The same year also gave us two more cinematic games of note. Firstly, and most obviously, we got Metal Gear Solid. The first MGS was important not just because it told an adult story, but because all the cutscenes were rendered in-engine, a technique that would become the industry standard in years to come. And secondly, we got this brilliant bit of scene setting from the original Fallout with that now legendary line spoken by the equally legendary Ron Perlman. We'll come back to him in just a bit.
War never changes.
Onto the noughties then, and a period of change where graphical improvements would see gameplay and cutscene eventually begin to merge. But let's start with the classics. So far, we've tried to stick to multi-format games, but 2000's Vagrant Story deserves a special mention for being brilliantly storyboarded, cinematically edited, and thoughtfully conceived. Two more examples of Japanese games setting the standard followed a year later. 2001's Silent Hill 2 is a superb example of how to use in-game cutscenes to make your central antagonist terrifying. Ask anyone who played it at the time and you'll see how those establishing shots of Pyramid Head really left their mark. And then we have Final Fantasy X, continuing the venerable tradition of the series having many of the greatest cinematic moments in gaming. The impact of Yuna sending the spirits of an entire village destroyed by Sin is beautiful, sad, and moving, and it remains a Final Fantasy high point. On to 2003 and an interesting development in an otherwise ordinary game.
Damn, not who I was hoping for.
Enter the Matrix was one of the first examples of cutscenes being recorded alongside the movie that inspired them. The game includes an hour of live footage written and directed specifically for the game by the Wachowskis, and the in-game cutscenes feature motion capture directly from the actors and stunt doubles. It didn't stop Enter the Matrix being slightly average, but it was a nice touch nonetheless. Now, we can't talk about cutscenes without pausing in 2004 to gush about Onimusha 3. The introduction remains one of the most accomplished video game cutscenes ever, with Sumanasuke taking on an entire Genma army. Even now, it makes most Hollywood action sequences look like improv theatre. And 2004 was a vintage year for legendary video game cutscenes, because it also gave us the return to sender scene from Halo 2. Not only is this a fine example of the Master Chief doing what he does best, growling and killing aliens, but it also proves that the presence of Ron Perlman immediately improves all of your in-game cinematics. From now on, the lines begin to blur as games start to look as good as their cinematics, but a few titles still stand out. The intro to 2007's BioShock is a superb bit of scene setting which influences everything you experience in the game that follows. And despite the divisive reception, the cutscenes in Final Fantasy XIII demonstrate why the series still elicits so much excitement. No previous Final Fantasy did such a good job of narrowing the gap between pre-rendered and real-time cutscenes. We're reaching the end of our journey now, not because cutscenes have disappeared, but because they're so ubiquitous that they no longer stand out. 2010's Deadly Premonition deserves a special mention for just being so downright weird, and for attempting to recreate the dreamlike oddness of Twin Peaks. And we should also mention this surprisingly tender moment from Gears of War 3. And if you haven't completed it, or if you're just feeling a bit emotionally fragile, feel free to skip ahead 10 seconds to avoid spoilers. Ready? Good. Dom's death in the third Gears of War game proves that there's still a place for quiet moments in the most bombastic games. Well, not that quiet, but you get the idea. Let's also stop off in 2013 for Mass Effect 3's Battle for Earth. Whatever you thought of the ending of the game itself, the climactic final battle was an incredible reward for hours and hours of interstellar adventuring. Watch all your hard work come together like this, and it's difficult not to feel a shiver down your spine. And finally, for now, let's talk about Injustice 2. There have been other recent games with more dramatic cutscenes, but the second Injustice title deserves a mention because of how good it is at the small moments. For what feels like maybe the first time ever, Injustice 2 shows us how games can be subtle as well as dramatic, telling stories through minor facial expressions. It's what all the best actors do, and it's a significant step forward for video game cinematics. And there you go, almost 40 years of gaming cutscenes in one video. Did we miss out any of your favourites? Are there any cinematics that still stay with you today? And do you love cutscenes, or do you think they don't belong in games at all? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. As ever, please give us a like if this jogged any memories, and please subscribe to Logitech G for more weekly shows and features. Thank you very much for watching.